I'm Audrey Harrison, 29, a nurse who thought I'd found my fairy tale when I fell for Luke Williams, a successful architect from old money. What I didn't expect was his parents forcing a prenup 3 weeks before our wedding. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. This is Luke's house, and you'll leave with nothing, Eleanor had said with cold eyes, while Luke just stood there, trapped between love and dignity. I signed that paper, never imagining how those words would haunt us, or how my surprise $22 million inheritance would completely flip their script. I met Luke on a Tuesday evening in April. I remember it clearly because I had just finished a 12-hour shift and was exhausted. I just got off a flight and came straight here, he explained. We chatted briefly, and before leaving, he asked if he could take me for coffee sometime. I hesitated. He was charming, attentive, and surprisingly down-to-earth for someone who, as I would later learn, came from significant wealth. We talked for hours about our dreams, our childhoods, our favorite books. Unlike previous dates I'd been on, Luke actually listened when I spoke about my passion for nursing. I had a strict policy of not dating patients' relatives or friends, but something about him made me say yes. Most were from similar privileged backgrounds: investment bankers, real estate developers, corporate lawyers. At a dinner party at his friend Jason's penthouse, I overheard a conversation that made my stomach turn. Could I have just a few minutes? Something about his genuine concern for his friend made me bend the rules slightly. Luke always insisted on paying whenever we went out, even when I offered to split the bill. Initially, I found it gentlemanly, but over time, it felt like he was subtly reminding me of our financial disparity. She's not like anyone I've dated before, and it must be nice dating someone so nurturing. Still, I believed love could bridge our different worlds. When he proposed on our 1-year anniversary during a hot air balloon ride at sunrise, I said yes without hesitation. I'd asked, both referring to the ring and the speed of our relationship. "You work so hard saving lives," he'd say. "Let me handle this. 10 minutes, I said with a small smile. Luke was romantic in ways I'd only seen in movies: surprise picnics in the park, handwritten notes left on my windshield, weekend trips to charming bed and breakfasts. When he first took me to his downtown loft, I was intimidated by the sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but he never made me feel out of place. "It's just stuff," he'd said, noticing my discomfort as I looked at what was clearly an expensive painting. Richard was tall like Luke, but with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of monetary value. Eleanor was slim and elegant in an understated designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. None of it matters as much as finding someone who gets you. Family portraits lined one wall, generations of Williams men and women staring down with the same confident expression Luke often wore. As we drove through the wrought iron gates up the curved driveway, my palms began to sweat. The house, no mansion, was a sprawling Georgian-style structure with perfectly manicured gardens and a fountain in the center of the circular driveway. He was visiting his college roommate, who had undergone an appendectomy. "Darling, tell your father about that new project your firm is bidding on." I was checking the patient's vitals when Luke walked in with a bouquet of flowers and a warm smile that instantly made the room feel brighter. "But I can't take 2 weeks off work," I'd explained, "and I can't afford this." "I've already cleared it with your nursing director," he said proudly, "and it's my treat." "You deserve it." I was torn between appreciation and discomfort. While his intentions seemed good, it felt like my independence was being eroded bit by bit. After graduating from nursing school with honors, I started working at Westside Medical Center, one of the best hospitals in the region. I threw myself into my career, working long shifts in the intensive care unit. I loved being a nurse despite the emotional and physical demands. There's something incredibly fulfilling about being there for people during their most vulnerable moments. Before I continue this journey, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Growing up in Millfield, a small town where everyone knew everyone, I lived a modest life with my parents. My father worked at the local factory, and my mom was an elementary school teacher. We weren't poor, but we certainly weren't wealthy. We lived in a small 3-bedroom house, and I shared a room with my sister until I left for nursing school. My parents had always emphasized the importance of hard work, integrity, and kindness over material possessions. These values shaped me into who I am today. My colleagues became like family, and I built a reputation as someone reliable and compassionate. "Sorry, visiting hours are almost over," I said, trying to sound professional despite noticing how attractive he was. When he left, he stopped by the nurse's station to thank me. Our first date was at a small coffee shop downtown. Our relationship progressed quickly. 6 months into our relationship, I started noticing small things. Then there were the decisions made without consulting me. He once booked an expensive vacation to Bali, presenting it as a surprise. Meeting his friends was another eye-opener. "So you're actually dating a nurse?" A woman named Diana asked Luke while I was supposedly out of earshot. "That's different for you." "Audrey is amazing," Luke had defended. "I'm sure she's sweet," Diana had replied with a condescending smile. Luke hadn't properly challenged her underlying judgment, and that hurt. The ring was extravagant, a flawless 3-carat diamond that felt heavy on my finger. "Are you sure it's not too much?" "Nothing's too much when it comes to you," he had replied, kissing me as the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Despite the warning bells occasionally ringing in the back of my mind, I was in love and ready to build a life with Luke, differences and all. The Williams family estate sat on 5 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. "You grew up here?" I asked Luke, trying to keep the awe from my voice. "It's just a house," he said with a shrug that suggested he'd never known anything different. The interior was even more impressive: marble floors in the entryway, crystal chandeliers hanging from high ceilings, antique furniture that looked too valuable to actually sit on. Richard and Eleanor Williams were waiting in what they called the small sitting room, which was larger than my entire apartment. "So this is the nurse," Eleanor said after Luke introduced us, her tone making my profession sound like a curious hobby rather than a career. "Audrey is the head nurse in the ICU," Luke corrected, squeezing my hand. "How dedicated," Eleanor replied. "It must be exhausting work." "It can be," I admitted, "but it's also incredibly rewarding." "I'm sure," she said with a dismissive smile before turning to Luke. That set the tone for the evening. Every attempt at conversation was redirected. Every mention of my work met with polite disinterest. During dinner in their formal dining room, served by their housekeeper Maria, I noticed how different Luke was around his parents. His usual warmth and playfulness disappeared, replaced by formal responses and perfect table manners. "Luke, you should attend. Their daughter Heather just returned from Europe. The Montgomerys have invited us to their charity gala next month," Eleanor mentioned as we ate. "I'll bring Audrey," Luke replied, reaching for my hand under the table. "Oh," Eleanor said, her smile tightening. "It's quite exclusive. I'm not sure if there are extra invitations." I sat silently, feeling increasingly out of place, despite Luke's occasional reassuring glances. "Then I won't go," Luke said firmly, surprising me with his directness. Richard cleared his throat. "The Montgomerys are important connections, son. Their foundation funds half the projects your firm handles." The conversation moved to investments, society acquaintances, and family friends I'd never heard of. After dinner, Eleanor gave me a tour that felt more like an exhibition of their wealth, the original artwork, the antiques passed down through generations, the china that had belonged to some distant relative who'd been an ambassador. But Maria has been with us for 20 years. She knows how things should be done. The Williams family has always valued quality and tradition, she said, running her fingers along a mahogany sideboard. This piece is from the 1800s. Luke will inherit it, of course. When Eleanor excused herself to speak with Maria about some household matter, I attempted to connect with her by offering to help. "Oh, that's sweet," she said with a laugh that made me feel childish. "They've had this vision of my life mapped out since I was born, but I choose you, Audrey, not their vision." The subtle message was clear. I didn't belong in their world, and I didn't know how things should be done. Later that night, as Luke drove us back to the city, I couldn't hold back my feelings anymore. "Your mother doesn't like me," I said quietly. "Yes, they're snobs, and yes, they're overly concerned with status and connections, but they don't decide who I love." Each attempt was politely but firmly redirected. Despite my reservations about his parents, I loved Luke and was committed to our future together. "We're going to create our own life, our own family, I promise." "Mom's just protective," Luke replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "She's like that with everyone at first. She practically suggested you should be dating Heather Montgomery instead." Luke sighed. "That's just how they are. They made me feel like I don't belong," I admitted. Luke pulled the car over and turned to face me. Luke had talked about buying a house in a neighborhood I loved, starting our own traditions, maybe even having children in a few years. That was the future I held on to as we moved forward with the wedding plans, a future where we defined our own happiness, independent of his family's expectations. "Listen to me. My parents come from a different generation with different values." His words reassured me, and I wanted desperately to believe him. Over the next few months, as we planned our wedding, I made several more attempts to bond with Eleanor, offering to help with wedding details, asking about family traditions, even trying to learn about their cherished antiques. The wedding planner handles those details. Perhaps something simpler would suit you better. These family matters are quite complex. Nothing unusual, just protection of family assets and properties. Eleanor perched elegantly in an armchair, Luke and I side by side on an uncomfortable leather sofa. The tension in the room was palpable. Luke continued to minimize his parents' behavior. "They'll come around," he would say. "Just give them time." The legal language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out at me. I focused instead on our relationship and our plans. I should have seen the prenup coming, but somehow I didn't. 3 weeks before our wedding, just as final preparations were falling into place, Luke called on a Thursday evening. "My father wants us to come over tomorrow for a family meeting," he said, his voice oddly formal. "Our attorney Gregory can explain any sections you don't understand." "What about?" I asked, immediately anxious. "Just some wedding details, I think," he replied vaguely. The next day, we sat in Richard's wood-paneled home office, Richard behind his massive desk. Richard placed a thick document on the desk. The implication was clear. I was an outsider, potentially a gold digger, someone they needed to protect their precious son and assets from. As you know, the Williams family has significant assets that have been carefully managed across generations, but arrangements can be modified if necessary. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. "This is a standard prenuptial agreement," Richard continued, sliding the document toward us. "My parents have built something they want to protect. This isn't personal, just to protect the family businesses and properties. It doesn't mean anything about us. It means your family thinks I'm marrying you for money. Your mother literally said I would leave with nothing. How is that not personal? It means they've prepared for our divorce before we've even gotten married." I looked at Luke, who wouldn't meet my eyes. The next day, I called Grace Thompson, an attorney I could actually afford. After reviewing the prenup, she frowned deeply. We assumed you'd have mentioned this already, Luke, Eleanor added with a slight edge to her voice. But these high-powered family attorneys usually don't budge much. If you want my honest advice, I'd reconsider the marriage if he insists on these terms. If you divorce, you could walk away with almost nothing, regardless of how long you're married or what you contribute to the relationship. I was going to, Luke mumbled, still not looking at me. With shaking hands, I took the document and began reading. Separate property shall remain separate. No claim to family businesses or investments. The family home at 1420 Lakeview Drive shall remain the exclusive property of Luke Williams. This is a lot, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. If either of us cheats, it nullifies certain protections. I also want provisions that recognize the length of the marriage. More protections for me the longer we read together. That's fairly standard, Richard replied dismissively. What we want to make clear, Eleanor interjected, her voice crisp, is that family assets remain protected. This is Luke's house, and you'll leave with nothing if things don't work out. That's just common sense. The bluntness of her statement hit me like a physical blow. I need time to look this over, I managed to say. Of course, Richard nodded. But we'll need it signed before the wedding. The invitations have been sent. The threat was thinly veiled. Sign, or the wedding might not happen. In the car afterward, I finally broke down. How could you blindside me like this, 3 weeks before our wedding? It's just a formality, Luke insisted, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. That's not fair, Luke argued. Not personal? I was incredulous. Luke's expression hardened. You're overreacting. This is standard for families like mine. Families like yours, I repeated, the divide between us suddenly seeming insurmountable. That night I stayed at my apartment alone, crying until I had no tears left. This is extremely one-sided, she explained. It essentially protects all of Luke's assets while leaving you vulnerable. Can I negotiate changes? I asked. You can try, Grace replied cautiously. When I met with Luke that evening, I tried to explain my concerns. I'm not signing this as written, I told him firmly. It's completely one-sided. What do you want to change? He asked, sounding exasperated. For starters, I want a mutual infidelity clause. Luke ran his hands through his hair in frustration. My parents won't like this. This isn't about your parents, Luke. This is about us and our future. After several tense days and multiple drafts, Luke finally presented me with an ultimatum. My parents are getting impatient. Either sign the prenup with the small changes we've agreed to, or we need to postpone the wedding. Postponing meant losing deposits, explaining to all our guests, and facing the humiliation of a delayed wedding because his family didn't trust me. More importantly, it meant Luke was choosing his family's demands over my feelings. It wasn't ideal, but I loved Luke and wanted to believe his promises that this document would gather dust in a drawer somewhere, never to be needed. After another sleepless night, I made my decision. I would sign the modified prenup, which now included the infidelity clause and some minor concessions about personal property. They had won this round, and they knew it. Luke squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you. This means nothing for us, I promise." The day I signed, I caught the smug exchange of glances between Richard and Eleanor. Rather than finding our own place, as Luke had once suggested, we moved into a house in an exclusive neighborhood that his parents had purchased but put in Luke's name, another asset protected by the prenup. I tried to make it our home, painting rooms and buying furniture that reflected our taste rather than the Williams aesthetic, but Eleanor had other ideas. I had surrendered something of myself, compromised my values for love. The Williams homes have always had a certain elegance to them. What I didn't know then was how prophetic Eleanor's cold words would prove to be, and how differently things would unfold than any of the Williams family could have imagined. As I signed my name on that final page, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just signed away more than legal rights. I walked down the aisle in a designer gown chosen by Eleanor, past 200 guests, mostly Luke's family, to classical music selected by Eleanor. Each visit included subtle criticism of my homemaking, my decorating choices, even the way I organized the kitchen, and rearranging things while I stood by, stunned by her audacity. Despite the tensions leading up to the day, I was genuinely happy and hopeful. He constantly offered advice on our spending, investments, and my career. As we exchanged vows, Luke looked at me with such love that I believed we could overcome any obstacle together. Our wedding was picture perfect, exactly as Eleanor had orchestrated it. I was promoted to head nurse of the ICU, a position that came with more responsibility and a modest pay increase. When I excitedly shared the news with Luke and his parents during dinner, Eleanor merely nodded politely. Later, when I mentioned my hurt feelings to Luke, he seemed genuinely confused. Our honeymoon in the Maldives was blissful, 2 weeks of paradise where Luke was fully present, attentive, and loving. Away from his parents' influence, he was the man I had fallen in love with. She's focused on helping people. Have you considered hospital administration? At least the pay would be better. We talked about our future, made plans, and I allowed myself to believe that the prenup incident was behind us. Luke started working later, attending more business dinners, and spending weekends golfing with his father and associates. At charity galas, golf club dinners, and cocktail parties with Luke's circle, I was clearly viewed as an oddity, the nurse who had somehow landed at Williams. Luke had been making large purchases, designer clothing, expensive dinners, even jewelry, that weren't showing up in our joint expenses. Women would ask patronizing questions about my little job or comment on how brave Luke was to marry outside their social circle. The prenup wasn't just a document forced by his parents. It was a reflection of Luke's own compartmentalized view of our marriage. My friendships had suffered as I tried to fit into Luke's world. My family, though loving, couldn't relate to the specific challenges of my marriage. I was living in a beautiful house that never felt like home, with a husband who resembled less and less the man I had fallen in love with. There were parts of his life I wasn't welcome in, decisions I wasn't consulted on, and a fundamental lack of partnership that became increasingly difficult to ignore. I still hoped we could find our way back to each other, but increasingly I wondered if we had ever truly been on the same path at all. Men would speak to Luke about business and investments, then turn to me with simplified explanations as if I couldn't possibly understand complex topics. Reality hit when we returned. That color is rather vibrant for a dining room, isn't it? She commented during an unannounced visit 3 weeks after we'd moved in. The man who had once said, "That's just stuff," when referring to his expensive possessions now lectured me about using the everyday towels instead of the guest towels when my friend Jessica visited. The man who had admired my dedication to nursing now complained about my long shifts and weekend work. "I'm calling regarding your great-uncle Harold Harrison's estate. I'd met him only once as a child." The man who had promised we would create our own life increasingly deferred to his parents' expectations and values. Mr. Harrison passed away last month, and his will is quite specific. "I like color," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "It makes his space feel lived in." "Well, it certainly looks lived in now," she murmured, running a finger along the shelf as if checking for dust. These visits became regular occurrences. Eleanor would stop by often without calling first to deliver housewarming gifts we didn't need or to check how we were settling in. The good china should be in the dining room cabinet, not mixed with everyday dishes, she instructed once. Actually, opening cabinets Luke was no help. "She's just trying to be helpful," he would say. "Mom has always been particular about homes." Richard's interference was more financial. "Nursing is admirable, but the hours are terrible," he commented over dinner at their house one evening. I like working directly with patients, I replied. Not every career choice is about maximizing income. Richard exchanged a glance with Eleanor that clearly communicated what they thought of my priorities. As months passed, I noticed Luke subtly changing. My career, meanwhile, was thriving. That's nice, dear. Richard, tell Luke about the new development opportunity in Westlake. My achievement was dismissed in favor of business talk that deliberately excluded me. They said congratulations, didn't they? What more did you want? Social events were another battlefield. Luke never corrected them. Sometimes he even joined in, patting my hand while saying things like, Audrey doesn't worry about investment strategies. The divide between us grew wider. We began arguing about things that had never been issues before: money, time with friends, family obligations. One evening, while paying bills, which Luke had largely left to me despite his concern about my financial acumen, I discovered credit card statements for accounts I didn't know existed. When confronted, he was defensive. I've always had separate accounts. Did you think everything would be joint just because we're married? I thought we'd be transparent, I replied. I thought we were building a life together. We are, he insisted. But some things are simpler kept separate. I began to realize how naive I'd been. As our first anniversary approached, I felt more isolated than ever. I still loved Luke, or at least the person I believed he could be. What I didn't know was that the biggest test of our marriage, and the most unexpected twist in my life, was just around the corner. The call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while I was charting at the nurse's station. An unfamiliar number with a Boston area code. Is this Audrey Harrison Williams? A formal male voice asked when I answered. Yes, this is she, I replied, stepping away from my colleagues for privacy. This is Martin Blackwell from Blackwell Hayes and Partners in Boston. Great Uncle Harold. I vaguely remembered him, my father-esque uncle who had left the family decades ago after some long-forgotten disagreement. I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake, I said. I barely knew my great-uncle. Nevertheless, Miss Williams, you are the sole beneficiary of his estate. I sat down, suddenly lightheaded. What ... What does that mean exactly? Mr. Blackwell cleared his throat. It means, Miss Williams, that you have inherited approximately $22 million in liquid assets, plus real estate holdings in Massachusetts and Vermont, and a small but valuable art collection. The room seemed to spin. That's impossible. Uncle Harold was just ... normal. Mr. Harrison was quite private about his wealth. The lawyer explained. He made some excellent early investments in technology companies in the 1980s and lived well below his means. Would you be available to meet in Boston next week to discuss the details? Luke repeated, his voice rising with excitement. Are you serious? This is incredible, Audrey. I'm coming home right now to celebrate. That night, as we drank champagne, he was full of ideas about what we could do with our windfall. I agreed in a daze, hanging up just as Luke called. This changes everything. He came home early from work, planned romantic dinners, and suddenly seemed interested in my opinions again. He accompanied me to Boston for the meeting with Mr. Blackwell, attentively taking notes as we discussed trusts, investments, and tax implications. Still, I wanted to believe this could be a fresh start for us, a chance to build something together on more equal footing. Without thinking it through, I immediately shared the news. The Williams family has connections with the best financial advisors in the country. We're happy to make introductions. $22 million. The people who had treated me as an unwelcome outsider for over a year were now embracing me as family, all because I now had money of my own. Eleanor called to invite me to lunch. Just the two of us, a first in our relationship. Perhaps with financial parity came respect. Perhaps Luke and I could now truly build our life on our own terms. Unlike the advisors Richard suggested, Samantha was independent and focused solely on my interests. Luke arrived an hour later with champagne and a bouquet of roses, more enthusiasm than he'd shown in months. We could invest in that beachfront property Richard told us about, he suggested, or become angel investors in some of the startups my friends are launching. I nodded along, but something felt off about his sudden attentiveness. Over the next few days, Luke's behavior shifted dramatically. Richard knows people who could double your money in a year. The Williams family's reaction to my inheritance was equally dramatic. Let's establish proper trusts and investment structures before making any major decisions. His car wasn't there. On a hunch, I drove to Ivy Lane, an upscale residential area where I knew his ex-girlfriend Allison had recently purchased a townhouse. Luke's car was parked in her driveway. "Audrey, darling," she cooed across the table at her country club. "I've been thinking we should spend more time together." Luke kissed Allison deeply on her doorstep before getting into his car. I took several photos with shaking hands, then drove home and waited. His kiss goodbye was distracted, and he seemed overly concerned about his appearance for a client meeting. Perhaps a shopping trip to New York? I know all the best boutiques. Richard was more direct, inviting us over for a financial strategy session. "You'll want to protect and grow this windfall," he explained, presenting a folder of investment opportunities. The late nights at work resumed, along with vague explanations about client meetings and project deadlines. Their sudden warmth and inclusion might have been flattering if it hadn't been so transparently motivated by my new financial status. Despite my reservations, part of me hoped this might be a turning point. Allison reached out about a potential project, and things evolved. It didn't mean anything. My optimism was short-lived. Acting on a recommendation from Mr. Blackwell, I hired Samantha Kelly, a financial advisor with experience managing sudden wealth. "You'll want to move cautiously," she advised during our first meeting. "Sudden wealth can complicate relationships and attract opportunists." "My husband is excited about investment opportunities," I mentioned. Samantha's expression remained neutral. "I recommend keeping your inheritance separate for now." I had been an accessory, a different kind of trophy than his parents might have chosen, but a possession nonetheless. My newfound wealth had made me more valuable to the Williams family, but it hadn't made me more respected or loved. When I shared this plan with Luke, his enthusiasm cooled noticeably. "That seems unnecessarily complicated," he argued. "I'd rather be cautious," I replied. "This is a lot to process." The question now was how to end it on my terms. Luke's mood shifted, and he became increasingly distant again, and screamed into a pillow until my throat was raw. Then I took a shower, made a cup of tea, and began to plan. "But I can't look at you right now." His office was minimalist and elegant, his manner professional but warm. One night, when Luke said he'd be working late on an important presentation, something didn't feel right, and a recommendation for the best divorce attorney in the city. Following an instinct I couldn't explain, I drove past his office building at 9 p.m. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, tears streaming down my face, before I saw them emerge. When Luke arrived home shortly after midnight, he casually mentioned the productive client meeting and headed for the shower. "How's Allison?" I asked when he returned to our bedroom. He froze, color draining from his face. "It states clearly that proven infidelity nullifies certain protections of separate property, particularly regarding the marital home and specific joint investments, especially given your inheritance and the duration of the infidelity," Marcus confirmed. "More importantly, this clause weakens the entire prenup. It shows the agreement wasn't merely about protecting family assets, but about relationship expectations." "What?" "Your client meeting on Ivy Lane at Ellison's house." I showed him the photos on my phone. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, falling back on the oldest cliché in the book. "Really? Because it looks like you're kissing your ex-girlfriend while lying to your wife?" "It just happened," Luke said, switching tactics. How long? I asked, my voice deadly calm despite the storm inside me. Luke looked away. A few months? A few months? I repeated. So before my inheritance? What does that have to do with anything? He asked, genuinely confused. Everything, I replied. It has everything to do with everything. In that moment, with stunning clarity, I saw the truth of my marriage. Luke had never truly seen me as an equal partner. Get out, I said quietly. Go stay at your parents' house. Or with Allison. I don't care. You're overreacting, Luke insisted, his tone eerily reminiscent of our prenup argument. We can fix this. Get out. After Luke left, I sat alone in our bedroom, his bedroom, according to the prenup, and realized with startling certainty that our marriage was over. I allowed myself one night of complete breakdown. I cried until my eyes were swollen, threw a vase against the wall, one Eleanor had given us. First, I called Jessica, my best friend who had remained steadfast despite my reduced availability since marrying Luke. I need a place to stay for a few days, I told her. I'll make up the guest room, she replied without hesitation. And I know just the lawyer. Marcus Reynolds had a reputation as a shark in divorce proceedings, particularly those involving significant assets. Before we discuss anything else, I said during our first meeting, I need to know about the prenuptial agreement I signed. Marcus carefully reviewed the document, focusing particularly on the modifications I'd insisted upon. This infidelity clause is your ace, he said finally, looking up with a slight smile. So the house, I began, could potentially be considered joint property despite being in Luke's name. Over the next several weeks, I lived at Jessica's while strategically planning my next steps. Working with Samantha Kelly, I secured my inheritance and trusts and accounts that Luke couldn't access. Marcus built a comprehensive case that portrayed not just a cheating husband, but a systematic pattern of financial and emotional control. With Marcus' guidance, I gathered evidence of Luke's affair, not just my photos. He sent flowers daily, left tearful voicemails, and even enlisted mutual friends to plead his case. But credit card statements showing gifts purchased for Allison, hotel receipts, and text messages Luke had carelessly left accessible on our shared iPad. Everyone makes mistakes. My parents think you're overreacting too. How are they taking the news about the infidelity clause in the prenup? I also documented the Williams family as financial manipulations, Eleanor's unilateral decisions about our home, Richard's pressure regarding my inheritance, Luke's secret accounts and spending. Luke's initial shock at my moving out quickly gave way to a campaign to win me back. It was one mistake, he insisted during a tense meeting to discuss logistics. We can go to counseling. We can start fresh. I worked with Marcus to time the divorce filing strategically, ensuring all my financial protections were in place and all evidence was properly documented. The invitation came with heavy implication that my inheritance would be a central topic. When his charm offensive failed, his approach darkened. We should discuss how to move forward as a family. You're being ridiculous, he said during our next encounter. The evidence is solid and the timing is right. Are you sure you want to do it this way? Richard mentioned connections who could make my professional life difficult. Luke alternated between begging and bullying. It's time they learn exactly who they've been dealing with. About Luke's betrayal. About the years of subtle humiliation and control. Expenses he had always handled before, but now claimed were our responsibility. I packed my briefcase with the divorce papers and evidence, then drove to the Williams estate for what would be my final visit. The frightened nurse who had signed that prenup was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to claim it. Maria served the first course, Eleanor's favorite soup, as Richard launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. The Williams name carries with it certain responsibilities and expectations. While recent events have been unfortunate, we believe in working through difficulties together. It became clear that he'd been counting on access to my inheritance all along. I'm sure they do, I replied calmly. A united front. The table was set with the family's finest china, crystal, and silver, a show of wealth and tradition, as always. We've taken the liberty of researching some excellent marriage counselors, and Luke's expression confirmed he hadn't shared that detail with Richard and Eleanor. As weeks passed, Luke became increasingly demanding about financial matters. He needed money for investments, for house repairs, for car payments. The Williams family pressured me from all angles. Eleanor called with thinly veiled threats about family loyalty. With proper management, your inheritance could significantly enhance the Williams portfolio. Through it all, I maintained a calm exterior while gathering evidence and preparing my case. The final pieces fell into place when Luke invited me to dinner at his parents' house, a family meeting to discuss our future. The Williams family has always believed in working through difficulties together, Eleanor said over the phone. We can start fresh, build the life we talked about. I agreed to attend, knowing it would be the perfect setting for what I had planned. The evening before this fateful dinner, I met with Marcus one last time to review our strategy. The divorce papers are ready, he confirmed. I thought about the smug satisfaction on Eleanor's face when I signed the prenup. I'm sure, I replied. They've underestimated me from day one. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The next day, I prepared carefully for the family dinner, choosing a sleek black dress and subtle jewelry, projecting confidence rather than conciliation. As I pulled into the familiar circular driveway, I took a deep breath and reminded myself of the strength I discovered through this ordeal. The Williams family was gathered in the formal dining room when I arrived, Richard at the head of the table, Eleanor to his right, Luke to his left. Audrey, darling, Eleanor greeted me with air kisses. You look determined. Thank you for coming, Richard added, gesturing to the empty chair beside Luke. We have much to discuss. Luke attempted to take my hand as I sat down, but I subtly shifted away, placing my briefcase on the floor beside me. Family is the foundation of everything we value, he began. Eleanor nodded in agreement. Marriage has its challenges, but with proper guidance, these obstacles can be overcome. I ate my soup silently, letting them continue their carefully orchestrated performance. Luke has acknowledged his lapse in judgment, Richard continued, and is committed to rebuilding your trust. We've been discussing investment opportunities, Eleanor added, that would secure both your futures. I noticed how they said your inheritance, but the Williams portfolio, as if my money should naturally flow into their family coffers. Luke finally spoke, his voice practiced and contrite. I made a terrible mistake, Audrey, but I love you and I want to make this work. I finished my soup, dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin, and looked at each of them in turn. Are you finished? I asked quietly. They exchanged glances, slightly thrown by my calm demeanor. We've prepared some documents outlining the investment strategy, Richard said, reaching for a folder. With your inheritance and our connections, no, I interrupted, my voice firm but controlled. I meant asterisk, are you finished with this performance? This attempt to manipulate me? Because I certainly am. The silence that followed was profound. I reached for my briefcase and removed a thick envelope, placing it on the table in front of Luke. What's this? He asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Divorce papers, I replied, thoroughly prepared and ready for your signature. Eleanor gasped. Richard's face darkened. Luke stared at the envelope as if it might bite him. This is absurd, Richard blustered. After everything you've, what? I asked, my voice still remarkably calm, controlled, manipulated, belittled. I turned to Luke. His face paled as he reached the section detailing his infidelity and its implications under our prenuptial agreement. Open it. With reluctant hands, he opened the envelope and began scanning the documents. "You can't be serious," he whispered. "The infidelity clause that you and your parents dismissed as a minor concession?" I said. "It's quite serious. As your attorney will confirm, it substantially weakens the prenup's protections of separate property, particularly regarding our home." Richard snatched the papers from Luke's hands, scanning them with increasing alarm. Text messages, credit card statements, hotel receipts, photographs, all properly timestamped and authenticated. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. I interrupted, removing a USB drive from my briefcase. "This is outrageous. Your attorneys will advise you that fighting this would be costly and ultimately futile. I have documented evidence of Luke's affair with Allison Cooper spanning 5 months. You would have built a life with me, not around me. And you certainly wouldn't have betrayed me while calculating how to access my inheritance. I didn't plan to discover that the man I loved valued my bank account more than my heart. I simply protected myself when I discovered the truth. You planned this all along. I suggest you cooperate to avoid having the full evidence of your infidelity made part of the public record." "You?" "No, Eleanor. I didn't plan for my husband to cheat on me. I've documented every attempt at manipulation and coercion. And unlike when I signed your prenup, I now have the resources to fight back." Luke made one last desperate attempt. "Audrey, please, we can work through this. I made a mistake, but I do love you." I looked at him directly, seeing clearly for the first time the weakness behind his charm, the selfishness behind his smile. "If you loved me, Luke, you would have defended me to your parents from the beginning." I stood up, gathering my briefcase. "My attorney will contact yours tomorrow to finalize details. If you had actually welcomed me, if you had seen me as a person rather than an inconvenience or later an opportunity, I might have willingly shared my good fortune with this family," and began working with a therapist to process the betrayal and rebuild my self-confidence. The work gave purpose to my unexpected wealth and honored the great uncle whose generosity had indirectly led to my freedom. Jessica and other friends I had neglected during my marriage welcomed me back with open arms and unwavering support. He looked older, tired, less certain of his place in the world. That's what people who love each other do. Faced with the evidence and the potential public embarrassment, Luke agreed to a settlement that included my retaining substantial equity in our home. Despite its being in his name, a direct result of the infidelity clause in the prenup. Richard stood as well, his face flushed with anger. "You won't get away with this. The Williams family has connections you can't imagine." "Threatening me isn't wise, Richard," I replied calmly. Eleanor remained seated, her perfect posture finally slumped. The prenup they had forced upon me ultimately protected me in ways they never anticipated. That standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And the strength I discovered through adversity has transformed me in ways money never could. "We welcomed you into our family," she said, her voice bitter, its intrinsic. "Undeniable and entirely yours to claim no, Eleanor. You tolerated me until I had something you wanted. There's a difference. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to be reminded of their own worth." I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. You know what's ironic? The silence that followed me out the door was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly quick. The months that followed weren't easy. I moved into a new condo, focused on my career. With Samantha Kelly's guidance, I established the Harrison Foundation, focused on providing educational scholarships for nursing students and supporting healthcare initiatives in underserved communities. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Luke at a restaurant. "You look well," he said awkwardly. "I heard about your foundation. That's really great work." "Thank you," I replied, feeling not anger, but a kind of distant pity. "I'm sorry, Audrey, for everything. I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." I considered his words, recognizing the sincerity, but also the continued self-focus. Even his apology was about his loss, his realization. I hope you find what you're looking for, Luke, I said simply before walking away. Today, a year and a half after that dinner at the Williams estate, I'm finally at peace with my journey. The inheritance that the Williams family had coveted became the vehicle for my independence and purpose. I've learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in self-respect. That love without equality is just another form of control. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes losing what you thought you wanted opens the door to what you truly need. I'm still Audrey Harrison, no longer Williams, and my story is still being written, this time on my own terms. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when others underestimated you? Have you discovered strength through adversity that surprised even you? Share your experiences in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, your value isn't determined by anyone else's assessment of you.